So I'm here today with Amber. Really happy to meet you, Amber, from Love Fit. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself, please?
Of course I can. Yeah, I'm Amber, and I've been running Love Fit for 12 years this month, in fact. And I work specifically with women only, at all stages, but with a particular focus on the pregnancy and postnatal period, and then beyond.
And I know your fitness journey changed yourself when you became a mum, didn't it?
Very much so, yeah, 5 years ago. So I had worked with pre and postnatal women before. It's always been an area from the early days that I really enjoyed working with. I had a lot of friends who were having babies, and that kind of made me want to focus on that area. But then when I had my son, sort of many years after having been working with this woman, it gave me a different perspective, shall we say.
And so what are the common challenges that women face after having a baby in terms of their fitness?
Okay, I think the biggest challenge is actually the unknown. It's the not really knowing what is normal, as opposed to just what they maybe have heard about. And I think, especially when it comes to fitness, and there's a lot of taboo around women leaking, and problems with their pelvic floor, that people just assume that having a problem is normal. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is that people don't necessarily know when to seek help. And when to, and often they just want to ignore a problem that maybe they don't have to endure. I think another big problem that they face is the loneliness and the lack of support, particularly at the moment. And it's why I found the power of Zoom has been really wonderful for helping those women to stay a little bit connected, but just, yeah, not really knowing where to go, where to reach out, who to talk to for any of the problems that they might face. And then, of course, the age-old problem of this expectation to bounce back. And I despise that term, as I'm sure most women do. But I think even in this day and age, there's still a lot of subtle social media pressure, maybe isn't the right word, but just images of women, celebrities who've done this, done that, follow this program and you will look like me by just doing 3 squats, ta-da. And it's, you know, we all know it's rubbish, but it still plays on women's minds, particularly at a time when they're feeling a little vulnerable and often feeling very unsatisfied with how they feel and look.
So what can women do at home to maintain, first of all, and then rebuild, if needs be, their pelvic floor fitness after having a baby?
Okay, so I know you specifically said at home, but actually the very first thing I would implore all women to do is, after having a baby, is to go and see a women's health physio. So even if you don't perceive that you have problems, even if you think everything feels as good as it should, going and having that assessment, usually around the time that you'd be having the standard 6 to 8 week GP check, somewhere around there, in that first 2 to 3 months, I would say is a great time. There are women's health physios out there who specialize specifically with pelvis, pelvic floor, all of the musculature and the core, and they can assess you internally if needs be. I would recommend that, because then they can really understand what's going on with your body. Externally, if that's what you'd prefer, but they can really help you specifically. And that can just be one single appointment just to have that assessment and then send you away with any correctives. So that would be my kind of number one thing you can do to help maintain and then improve your pelvic floor. But in terms of stuff you can then do on your own, this doesn't necessarily seem obvious to people, but actually just a lot of breath work in the early days, particularly because that breathing, deep breathing, really affects your entire core, which includes the pelvic floor. So big diaphragmatic breath, just to reconnect you to your core, is actually so much more important than people give credit for. I think women are often so keen to have, what I get asked all the time is, what exercise can I do for my pelvic floor or for my diastasis, tummy gap? And actually often there's a lot of stuff that has to happen to set the foundation. So breath work is the biggest one I advise to all new mums. There's an app that a lot of women follow and a lot of physios recommend as well, called the Squeezy app. It's just like a little reminder to do your pelvic floor work. I would add a caveat, and this is why I always think it's important to go and see a physio in person, is that it's not always about strengthening your pelvic floor. Sometimes women have actually overactive pelvic floors and they need to do more of the release side of things. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But the Squeezy app is a great
to know that that's something to be aware of.
Yeah, yes, indeed. But the Squeezy app is great, just a little reminder that you can set on your smartphone just to get you to do regular work on your pelvic floor, whatever that work might be. And movement generally, actually, I think often women get scared to do stuff, especially if they're feeling uncomfortable in their bodies, if they are noticing that things don't quite feel like they did before, and then they think they should do nothing at all because the fear kind of drives them into that stillness. And actually the pelvic floor particularly loves movement. It needs movement. So being completely sedentary sometimes is as bad, if not worse, than actually getting up and doing something. And I know we'll come to this later, but it's just in terms of making sure you pick the right kind of exercise. But going out for some lovely walks once you're a bit more mobile after having the baby is great for your headspace. It often helps the baby get to sleep. So there's an added bonus there, whether they're being carried in a sling or in a pram, or being carried by somebody else and you're just getting to walk without that extra burden. Just getting out and walking and moving gently is what I would recommend early on. Another thing that you can do at home to help maintain good pelvic floor health is to consider your toileting habits. And I hope it's all right to start talking about toileting.
We talk a lot about baby poo when we talk to maternity nurses. I could get you out my knitted baby poo chart if you wanted.
Marvellous. Well, I want to now talk about mum's poo. So one thing I would really advise is it's very common, as a lot of women who've had babies will know, to suffer with a bit of constipation post-baby. There's a lot of reasons for this. And again, we could talk about this for hours, but it's partly to do with postural changes, which affect your diaphragm, which affects your digestive function. It's also just to do with hormones and things just slowing up generally. And it's to do with, basically hormones. Let's just blame it on the hormones a lot.
That's pretty much my entire course. Blame it on hormones.
That's pretty much it. But yeah, so I think one thing is when we find ourselves being a little constipated, as well as all the stuff we know, such as drinking plenty of water and making sure we're getting lots of fibre and all the lovely dried fruit and everything to help things move along. If you actually then find yourself in the position of having constipation, you still got to try and pass that. So the easiest thing to do without damaging or worsening the pelvic floor is when you're sitting on the toilet is to have your knees up higher than your hips. So what we would have in other cultures, in a lot of other cultures currently, where even though they have, very standard proper white toilets, they're on the floor. You put your feet either side. Anybody who's traveled to Asia will know, even in the fanciest shopping mall, that's just what you have. You don't have a bowl raised up and they squat down. And what that does, it improves your colorectal angle, essentially. It makes it much easier for stool to pass. So what I recommend here is not to jump up on your toilet necessarily, unless you're feeling particularly gymnastic, but is to get your feet raised a little way off the floor. So those who have a toddler at home almost certainly will have a step. So I always just recommend sliding the step across, popping your feet up. If this is your first baby, you don't have a toddler at home, 2 spare full toilet rolls that you might have upended work wonders. It's just the right height, and I won't grace you with a demonstration right now, but it's just the right height to get those knees up a little bit more, which just means that angle in that posterior area just changes, and it really does help. So if you ever find yourself straining with a bowel movement post-birth, and especially in the early days, it can feel really scary. You've got the stitches there. It's, it's a big thing that people talk about, is that poo after having a baby, but continuing into those early weeks and even months. If you can get those feet up and knees up, it will help, and it will relieve the pressure on that posterior pelvic floor. And then just coming to the other side of the pelvic floor and urination is trying to avoid what we call the jick. It's the just in case wee. So a lot of pelvic floor physios will refer to jicking, and that's the kind of, if you're about to go out, even if you went just 10 minutes ago, you think, oh, I better go just in case because I know my pelvic floor hasn't.
Having been pregnant for several months and having a wee every 30 minutes, you can get into that habit.
Exactly, you really can. So it's one of those things where actually just as long as you're you know, if you're about to embark on a long car journey or something, of course, maybe you do want to take care of that. But, you know, as long as you know there's going to be a toilet nearby, then trying not to just preempt all the time, because what it does is it trains your bladder to get those signals of fullness much earlier, and then you can start sort of extra types of incontinence, this kind of urge incontinence where you feel like you need to go when actually there's, you know, your bladder's 10% full. It shouldn't need to empty that early, and that just creates lots of sort of dysfunction in the pelvic floor. So I would encourage people not to jick too much. I guess at the moment people are at home a lot more, so maybe this is less of an issue, but it's definitely something to bear in mind, especially as we start to venture out a little more.
When is it recommended for women to return to exercise postnatally, both for those experiencing a caesarean birth and those who had a vaginal birth?
Okay, so the standard advice with a vaginal birth is around 6 to 8 weeks post-birth, and with a caesarean 10 to 12 weeks, once you've had clearance from your GP. So that's for your more formal exercise, whatever that means to you. But I think this is where I really like to get in and mention that a lot of women see it as for 6 to 8 weeks or 10 to 12 after a caesarean, you do nothing. And then somebody does a very rudimentary check of you, but mainly of the baby, which is totally understandable. It's not a specialist area for them, but then they say, yeah, you're fine. And people go back and try and do what they were doing pre-pregnancy. And there's no other time in life when you were going to start exercise, either full stop or after a long hiatus, that you would just go straight to this level. And yet for some reason, this seems to just not be a piece of information that women have after their babies. So really, that's when you can start to do a little bit more, but we'll talk about this more in detail afterwards. But there's a few very gentle things you can be doing before those 6 to 8 or 10 to 12 week periods. And then when you get to those markers, it's not a case of just throw yourself back in. That's when you can start to introduce a bit more what I would call formal exercise, as opposed to going out and running a marathon the next day or hitting up your local CrossFit gym for the first time. You know, there's definitely a gradual return that is very important.
So what would be the first things that women could be doing as they're moving towards exercise at those milestones?
Okay, so in the early phases, and I think the biggest and most important thing to say here is that for every woman, of course, there's a level of individuality. You know, the woman in front of me when I train people one-to-one is very different at different stages. You can't really compare it. But if we are going to talk as a general rule, prior to those markers for the vaginal and caesarean birth, you can start working on the breath work that we spoke about. You can do plenty of walking as long as your pelvis is feeling okay. I would add that for some women in the early weeks, just that general sort of heaviness in the pelvic floor, particularly if you've had stitches down there, just you might not feel that comfy going out on long walks for a while. So build it up. It might just be a little walk to the end of the road and back, and then a bit more. But once we're kind of getting nearer those milestones, then I would say, you know, going out for a nice walk with the baby or without can be really nice and a good way to start building up. Lots of mobility work. We have so many big postural changes, so lots of stuff to open up your chest. I'm a big fan of a light resistance band, sort of taking it back over your head, this kind of thing, just gentle movement for the neck. Hip circles, all those kind of just gentle things to move the body. Do lots of that, because all new mums know you spend a lot of time sitting and feeding and cuddling, and however you're feeding the baby, you will spend a lot of time like this, with rounded shoulders, sat on your bottom, pinned to a sofa. So anything you can do to just help alleviate some of those aches and pains is a really good place to start. And then my advice, and obviously I am biased because it's my line of work, but I genuinely would recommend that when you then want to start returning to exercise, it's not generally for most women the greatest idea to start going out for a run at 6 weeks postnatal. It might be for you, it depends on your body, but for most women, that's quite a lot of impact on the pelvic floor, even if it's feeling good. So my general advice is start off when you do hit those milestones and you're able to return to formal exercise, is to join a postnatal specific class. so that you are doing basically light body weight, maybe some, I said, light resistance bands, but it's resistance work to start strengthening the body without it being too heavy, too intense, and really at this point with zero impact. So when I run my classes, I mean, I do get women at different stages. You get those who've come in with an 8-week-old baby and those who've been coming for 6-7 months. So there will always be options, but none of the class is going to be star jumps or burpees or sprinting around a room. That's just not what we're focusing on at that point. We're trying to restore the core function, get them breathing with the movement so they can transfer that onto their daily life with a baby, and start to rebuild some of the muscles that have lost strength through all the postural changes.
So what should women be looking for in a postnatal exercise practitioner to make sure that they are going to someone who is experienced in postnatal exercise and is not going to do them more damage than good?
Okay, that is a great question. I think that there's probably two big things. I would say that a good postnatal instructor would screen you very thoroughly before you join the class. So I would say to any woman who's hoping to join a class post-baby, if it says pay as you go, just turn up on the day, be wary. They might thrust a form in your face to fill, but there's very little, if that's the start of a class with however many, it might be a small group or a big group, but either way, if there's lots of women there and the instructor's welcoming those other women in, and you've just scrawled a few things down, and also you're going to be kind of turning up maybe slightly apprehensive, you're just going to quickly write stuff down. You probably won't go into that much detail. From experience of having seen other classes as well, they're generally not that detailed, but it doesn't really give, and the instructor's not going to have a chance to really talk to you in any great detail. So there should be some pre-attending level of getting to know you. So I ask women a lot of questions, but just basic stuff is checking in on their pelvic floor. What mode of birth did they have? Have they got other children? How far apart were they born? What kinds of birth did they have? Where did they give birth? Was that where they intended? Because there might be a mental side of things as well if they didn't get the birth they wanted. Have they been to see a women's health physio? Has their bleeding stopped, etc., etc.? And just lots of little questions so that I can look at that before, and anything that's flagged, I can pick up the phone or back on an email prior to them turning up, so that when they're in the room, they're not having to disclose that in front of other people. And also if they haven't met you before and it's the first face-to-face and there's a lot of general hubbub, which there is in a room with people and babies. I know we're not in rooms at the moment, but you know what I mean. Probably even harder over Zoom. You definitely can't be having that publicly airing your things that are going on with your body. But yeah, I just think a really deep screening process so that you feel that the instructor knows you. I think if you turn up and that instructor doesn't even know how old your baby is and whether you gave birth by cesarean or in a pool with 0 stitches, there's a big difference between what's going to be appropriate for you. And the other one is that, any good instructor during the class if it's a postnatal class, there should be a lot of talk about the pelvic floor as well. So if they're just cracking on saying, do these squats, and they might still be offering modifications, there should definitely be different levels for different people in the class. But if there's no mention of why you're breathing this way or what that's doing to your pelvic floor or why I've asked you to get onto the floor in such a way, chances are they probably don't know themselves. So I would just say to anyone, be wary if you're able to just rock up and the class just feels like there's a difference between a postnatal class and a class where women are welcome to bring their babies. And I think that's probably the big news flash there are lots of classes that are billed as postnatal, baby friendly, but they're essentially just classes aimed at women who've got their kids at home and not necessarily focusing on rebuilding women's strength and doing stuff that is right for them at that time.
Great stuff. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Amber. On the slides afterwards, we're going to just pop your business name up.
So lovely. Thank you.
Women can so that maternity nurses can be referring their clients to you. Are you part of any networks in terms of networks with other colleagues across the country?
So I've got a good network here in Cambridge with women's health physio, some people at the Rosie maternity. I've been lucky enough to have a couple of the midwives actually attend my classes when they were pregnant with their babies. So I've got quite a nice little network there, and with some of the hypnobirthing courses as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time today,
Thank
Amber.
you very much. Lovely to talk to you. I hope that was helpful.
Great stuff.